Over to you, Madeleine.
Thank you. Like Jill says, my story is not that nice. It's not a nice story. But I just want to be clear before I start, my story doesn't own me anymore. I'm not defined by my story in any way. I am not a victim of what happened to me. I am the victor in my life now and have been for quite a while. So if you're ready, I will begin. I was really 13 when I knew that my childhood was over. I had a friend at school, which I'm sure you all have had, one of these ones that was just really super cool. You know, she had the Farrah Fawcett flicks in her hair. We were watching Charlie's Angels at the time. It was the late 1970s. She wore makeup. She had the best shoes. Everybody really wanted to be her. And she suggested a night out to me, and I just said yes. Now, her mum was away, and both of us lied about where we were staying, which I'm sure is something that we've all done at one point in our life. And somehow we managed to buy, of all things, a bottle of vodka, which I've never drunk or even smelt before. We took it to a local cafe in North London, where I used to live, and we mixed it with orange juice and we drank it in secret under the table. Now, I was just 13, this skinny little girl who had never really drunk before, and unsurprisingly, the drink went straight to my head, and soon I was just throwing up everywhere, and we were kicked out of the cafe. The two of the young men from our table, they put us into a taxi to go back to my friend's mum's empty flat. And you know, I've often wondered about the taxi driver from that night. If he had intervened in some way, he could have changed the course, the direction of my life completely, because the assault was already taking place in the back of the taxi. But he decided to be a bystander rather than an upstander. And I often thought, you know, doesn't he have a mother, a sister, an aunt, a daughter? But he chose to ignore what was taking place. His main aims, I guess, was to get us there as quickly as possible without me thrown up in the back of his taxi. So when we arrived at the block of flats, by this point I was literally legless, and the two of them kind of just bumped me up 4 flights of concrete stairs, and they put us into a separate room and we went inside straight away. Naively, I thought that they were there to take me out of the clothes that I'd been sick in, put me in the bed and let me sleep off the alcohol. But it became very clear very quickly that they were there for something else. It's very odd what takes place in your mind when you're being raped by two men. I could hear this barbecue down in the communal gardens, and I'm lying there whilst these men are violating my body, and I'm wondering to myself, I wonder what they're eating. Chicken or beef? Burgers or kebabs? Basically refusing to connect with the scene of the crime, my body. And when my attention came back into the room, I noticed that there was a wallpaper border which went around the top of the walls. It was made out of pink and grey bows, and I counted those bows over and over and over again. There were 44 bows in total, and it's actually still a number that follows me everywhere to this day. But after a while, the violence got worse, it escalated, and I literally left my body, which was really, I guess, surreal, because here I am on the floor, tied by a wrist and an ankle to the pipes of the radiator. But here I also am sitting on top of the wardrobe, watching the scene down below. Very near to the end, the one that I call the worst one, he picks up his knife and he holds it against my throat and he says to me, if you tell anyone, we will find you and we will kill you. And I believed him. And then they put me back in the bed and left. Later on, a few hours later in the morning, I could hear this jingly jangly sound, and I thought that they were coming back. I thought they were the sound from the keys on the door, but the sound wasn't the keys. They came from the bracelets on my friend's wrist, because she was now in bed next to me. She was dressed, I was naked. She hadn't been touched at all, and I had so many injuries on my body at that point, but I had no idea how I had got them. There was traces of blood, semen and excrement. There were bites, bruises, and cuts. There were cigarette burns on my breasts and on my thighs, and I had been stabbed. Everything was so hazy to me in that moment. The only thing that was clear was that nothing now could ever be the same again. I then ran myself the hottest bath that I could, and I scrubbed my body till it was red raw, which is something I continued to do for years. And once I got dressed, we both decided not to speak about it, tidy up the flat and go our separate ways. You see, already I was thinking, well, I'd lied to my parents, I'd bought alcohol, I'd met boys, what did I expect? I'd brought this on myself. This was my fault. And then we did go our separate ways. My friend went back to her grandma, which is where she was meant to be staying, and I went home to my parents. And then the following day, I went back to school. It was now Monday morning, as if nothing had happened. But I understand now, what we don't speak out leaks out of us. And it leaked out of me in so many ways. I developed an eating disorder. I had depression. I had fears, phobias, anxieties. But, really, worst of all, I used drugs and alcohol to numb out. But worst of all, really, was what it did to my head, what it did to my mind. Whilst I still couldn't really remember too many details from that night, they weren't really in my grasp, it just left me feeling so dirty, worthless, ashamed, and I didn't really understand the point to being me. And one day I decided to take as many pills as I could find. I emptied them into my hand, swallowing them down, hoping to end my life. Clearly, this didn't work, but I ended up in a children's psychiatric ward where I was going to spend a few months. When I was writing my book, I decided to ask for my hospital notes, which somebody suggested I could do. It wasn't an easy read, but I wanted to see if they had any idea why a normal 13-year-old girl literally turned into one overnight who couldn't speak, who couldn't eat, and hated herself. But there was nothing in my notes to suggest that they had any idea. So after a few months, I was sent home, but I wouldn't say my behaviour improved. I would say that I rebelled even more, partying hard. I remember one particular morning as I'm sneaking in late, my mum was waiting for me, and she is livid. She is shaking me and she's saying, don't you realise the danger that you're putting yourself under? Anything could happen to you. Inside my head, I'm trying to scream out the words, but I couldn't find my voice, that threat, and I was just silenced. So I decided to write a note, which I left on my pillow before I went to school. When I got home, my parents are both waiting for me, and my dad asked me if this was true, and I said yes. So they called my friend, the other girl that was involved, and she said no. It hadn't happened like she said it had. That they were nice young men. They were both sons of diplomats. They just brought us home. I was very confused by her reply, and it's something I've never had an answer to, and I can't drive myself crazy anymore, but it just spiraled me into an even darker place. My parents thought it would be a good idea to go away for some time, so I did. I went to Israel for a year. And I spent 6 months on a kibbutz, and I went to Ashkelon for the last 6 months of the year. And just before I came home, about a month before the end, I met this blonde, blue-eyed Glaswegian called Stephen. He's not actually very blonde anymore. He doesn't really have much hair anymore at all. But, he was the first man that I guess I felt safe with. Intuitively, I knew that I could trust him. And amazingly, when I came home from Israel, I went back to London and he went back to Scotland. He still wanted to see me, and I would drive this poor man mad. Why do you want to see me? Why do you want to spend time with me? How can you say that you love me? but he just always replied from a very grounded place that he did. And over time, I've seen that actually through his love, I learnt to take love in because I had built this brick wall around me still. I still had so many negative, self loathing feelings about myself, but I'd also learnt to give love out. And I slowly learnt to like myself. And I was hopeful maybe one day I might even love myself. After about 5 years or so of being together, he popped the question, of which I said yes, many years ago now. But I had to make sure that he remembered something I told him years ago. You see, I was terrified of the idea of giving birth. I thought in my mind that somehow it would be like being raped again. And so to me, the easiest answer was just not to become a mum. And I explained this to him, and he was okay. He said, fine, it will just be me and you. And that was great. And so we got married, and a couple of years later, I can remember the exact moment when I reversed my decision on becoming a mum. I was living in Scotland by this point once we got married, and we loved the sun, so I don't know why I live in Scotland. It's quite different to the 40 degrees that you've had down there. But we used to take all of our annual leave and go away somewhere warm and exotic every winter. And one particular winter, we'd been in Thailand for about 4 weeks, and we were walking along this beautiful beach on this island, Koh Phi Phi. And he turns around and just wonders out loud, how about starting a family? And I was already with my usual response of, I can't do that. You know the reasons why I've explained to you. But I don't know what it was. Something came in. And I thought, if I don't become a mum, then they've won. I'm still handing all my power and control over to these two men, and they still wouldn't even have any idea that I'm doing that. So in that moment, I decided that not only was I going to become a mum, but I was going to live my life as best as I possibly could, just refusing to be identified by what had happened to me. And I did. I went on to have 3 girls, my eldest daughter, 29, who's just got married in Mallorca. And, I really thought that that was it. But, trauma is multi-layered. And it took actually until Anna was 13 that all my memories returned. I thought that motherhood had really healed me. But literally out of nowhere, they just came rushing back in. I had nightmares and flashbacks and memories and pictures that I didn't remember. And I really thought I was going mad. I thought if it was so bad, surely I would remember it. Now, as a psychotherapist, I understand our mind is protecting us and it puts our worst memories far, far away. I mean, why would we want to look at them again? So I went to therapy. I was the worst kind of client because I wanted him to take these pictures away. He kind of laughed at me, and I realized actually the way in was going to be my way out. Near to the end of my therapy, I went for 3 years that last time, he suggested something outrageous to me one day. Perhaps these 2 young men weren't born rapists, he said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I was so angry. You see, for years I had this fantasy or fantasies. Somebody would kidnap the 2 of them, take them to an empty flat, beat them up, tie them up, rape and torture them for 4 to 5 hours on end. So they would get it. They would know that the impact of rape, it doesn't last for one night. It lasts decades. But he planted a seed in my head, and that seed started to grow. And I found myself needing to understand, how could these 2 young men know to be so violent towards another human being? And I remembered something that my manager, Anne, said to me years ago. She used to be a midwife, and she told me that she had delivered thousands of babies, and she never once met an evil one. And just like her, I do believe we are all born a blank sheet, a blank piece of paper, but somehow we get corrupted, we get conditioned by life. And then I wondered, what had they seen, heard, or even experienced to make them think it was okay to degrade me and humiliate me, treat me like that night. And somehow, I don't know how, but I started to feel compassion in my heart towards them. I mean, I've done a really good job at living my life as best as I can, but they have to live with what they've done to another human being. And I don't think that will be easy. I also saw that if I held on to all that anger, it wasn't going to harm them. It was only going to harm me, my husband, and my kids that I struggled to have for years. And then I realized, I could take this one step further. I could choose to forgive them in order to totally make peace with my past. But I have to be very clear here and say two things. I'm not a forgiveness preacher. I'm not here to tell you that the only way to heal is through forgiveness. That's not what I'm here to say at all. And I will never, ever forgive the act of rape because it was a total violation, not just on my body, but my mind and my psyche. But it allowed me to cut the chains that tied me to the past, that chained me to them, and it set me free. It was an act of self-love. It was totally self-empowering and my key to freedom. I also then understood, it's not about what happens to us that really is important. It's about what we do with it. That's what really matters. And I also started to understand I'm not what happened to me. I'm not my body or the things that they did to me. I'm so much more than events in my life. About, I don't know how many years ago, 2014, I think, or 17, I met an organisation who I know Jo Berry's online here. I also met her through them, called the Forgiveness Project. And their founder asked me if I would share my story on her website because she collects stories of forgiveness. We met through social media and she heard about my story. She said to me that I could be anonymous. I could just, put no name, no photo. But I was tired of being ashamed for a crime that was committed against my body. And I said, no, you can use my story, put my name and put my photo up. It's not to say that I wasn't nervous when I pressed the button and sent it onto social media. I was nervous, but it really changed something for me. And I really learnt the power of sharing our stories and what it can do for people. Through the Forgiveness Project as well, I was invited to be interviewed by Sir Trevor MacDonald. It was around the time my book was getting published, and they said to me, don't do too many publicity events because, by the time your book comes out, nobody will want you on the radio or TV, whatever. But when I heard it was Sir Trevor, I couldn't really say no, could I? Sir Trevor MacDonald. So they flew me to London and I met Sir Trevor, which he was just as gracious and as lovely as you expect him to be. And we did our interview and it went so well. But to me, it's what took place once the interview was shared that was more amazing. A friend of mine got in contact and she told me that her father had been listening to the radio that morning. And when she went round to see him, she said that he was just really animated and alive in a way that she hadn't really seen before. And she said to him, Dad, what have you done today? So I was listening to the radio this morning and I was hearing this woman sharing her story. Everything she said was true. I said, what are you talking about? She said, oh, it's just how it was in those days. I was a young boy and I couldn't find my voice. We couldn't talk about those kind of things. And she said, Dad, what is it you're trying to tell me? And he said, well, just like her, I was also raped when I was a young teenager. And in that moment, my friend's 81-year-old dad ended 64 years of his silence. Every time I speak, I think of him because he has really single-handedly shown me the power that comes when we share our stories. It's, incredible. But it also made me think of all the other people that have locked themselves into their own prison of silence due to their fear, their guilt, and their shame. And he's just shown me that just simply by sharing a story, just by simply listening to a woman on the radio who understood, he was able to untrap himself from his own prison and find his voice. So just before I end up speaking here today, I guess I'd like to leave you all with a few questions to think about. Do you have a hurt, an event, or a disappointment that you still hold on to? And if you do, what purpose does that serve? And could you, like me, learn to accept the facts, knowing that they can never be changed? And in order to live your best, bravest, fullest, most courageous life, let it go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madeleine. That was beautiful. In as much as it gives you hope for the future, that story about that 81-year-old. I remember one of our members once was speaking about some abuse that she had suffered as a child. And you forget that there's maybe 20 people in the room, but probably 3 or 4 can empathise with what's been said. So there may be people in our audience today that are, you know, appreciative that you've come out the other end and you've found a way forward. And maybe that's something that if they haven't already started that journey, that they might be able to do. Now, normally at this point, we are going to go into a breakout room, but I don't anticipate anybody sharing their story in any way, shape or form. But the questions that you've asked us is, do you have a hurt? Well, we can all say yes or no if you've had a hurt without going into any detail. And what purpose does that serve? And if you are happy to tell a story, and I've got half a dozen I could share, then you can see how we're all human. We all go through these pain barriers, and we all learn ways of dealing with it, whether it's dealing with it to our detriment or whether it's dealing with it in a positive, empowered way, as you have done. And can you accept that the facts are never going to change? What's happened has happened. So let's see if we can meet each other in groups of 3. Louise is going to put us into groups in a moment, with compassion. And I'd like to ask you each to think about if you feel like you should forgive, does that mean you have to forget? And just ask that question of each other. And also, possibly, what is stopping you from forgiving? Without any details. It's a bit like those TV adverts where somebody's on the couch and they're offloading their heart and it's the dog in the chair that's listening to them. Don't have to tell any details, but we are a listening ear to just kind of walk around what might be a bit of history or a subject for you. And if that's never occurred to you and it's never been an issue for you, then maybe share that as well and just acknowledge how blessed you are. I'm going to hand over to Louise now. Hopefully she's put one of our collaborators into each group. Just grab a room. There should be 3 people in each room, hopefully, and I'll see you on the other side.